The plate they handed me was one of the good ones, the white china with the thin gold rim that Eleanor bought 40 years ago for a Christmas we couldn't really afford, and for a moment that detail almost made me laugh, because someone had clearly thought carefully enough to use the good china while walking me out to the garage. "It's just more comfortable out here for you, Dad," Renee said, setting the plate down on the folding table beside my workbench, between the vise and a coffee can full of wood screws. "No stairs to worry about with your hip, and honestly, with the Sullivans here, the dining room's just too tight for everybody." I looked past her, through the door she'd left cracked open, at the dining room table set for 12 with a tablecloth Eleanor's mother had embroidered, at Derek's parents already seated near the head of the table, at my own daughter's father-in-law raising a glass to something I couldn't hear from where I stood. Then I looked at the space heater Renee had plugged in beside my chair, the extension cord snaking under the door from an outlet in the hallway, and I understood, with a particular clarity that comes only a handful of times in a long life, that this had all been planned. The heater. Good china. The explanation was ready before I'd even asked for one. "Of course," I said. "This is fine, sweetheart." She smiled, relieved, and went back inside, and the door clicked shut behind her the way a door clicks shut when someone has decided a conversation is finished before it ever really started. I sat down at the folding table in my own garage, in a house I had built with my own hands 41 years earlier, wearing a cardigan Eleanor had knitted the last Christmas before her stroke, and I ate a Christmas dinner cooling faster than it should have, surrounded by the smell of motor oil and cedar shavings, while 20 feet away, through a wall I had framed myself, my family laughed at something I would never know the punchline to. I did not say anything. Not that night, and not for a long while after. But I want you to understand, before the story goes any further, that there is a very specific difference between a man who says nothing because he has nothing to say, and a man who says nothing because he has already started paying very close attention. Before we go any further, a quick note. This story includes some fictional elements woven together to explore a real and, I think, important lesson, and any resemblance to actual people or places is entirely coincidental. If this kind of content isn't for you, that's completely understandable. Feel free to find something else on the channel. But if you've ever been quietly moved to the edges of your own family, treated as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a person to be included, stay with me. Tonight's story is about exactly that, and about what a man who spent his whole life building precision instruments does once he decides it's time to look closely at what's actually been built around him. My name is Harold Vance. Most people who've known me more than a week call me Hal. I'm 74 years old, and for 45 of those years I ran a precision machine shop called Vance Tool and Die, out of a converted warehouse 2 miles from the house I still live in now. I started that business at 29, with a single manual lathe I bought secondhand from a retiring machinist and a line of credit my own father co-signed against his life insurance policy, because banks in those days didn't lend easily to a young man with more ambition than collateral. Over 4.5 decades, Vance Tool and Die grew from that single lathe into a shop with 11 employees at its peak, manufacturing precision components for aerospace suppliers, medical device manufacturers, and, for about a decade in the 80s and 90s, specialized locking mechanisms for a handful of bank vault manufacturers who needed tolerances tighter than most shops in the region could reliably hold. I sold the operating business 9 years ago to my longtime shop foreman, a good man named Desmond Okafor who'd worked for me since he was 22, structuring the sale so I kept ownership of 4 patents I developed and held personally over the years, precision locking mechanisms and tolerance measurement tools that Desmond's company, and 2 other manufacturers under licensing agreements I still hold, continue to pay royalties on to this day. It isn't a fortune, not by the standards of the world most people imagine when they hear the word patent. But it's a steady $41,000 a year, arriving in quarterly payments, and it's the difference between a comfortable retirement and a threadbare one, and every dollar of it exists because I spent 4 decades learning how to make a mechanism do exactly what it was designed to do, no more no less, under tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. My wife, Eleanor, passed 3 years ago this past February, after a stroke that took her speech first and then, over 11 difficult months, nearly everything else, until a second stroke finally took the rest. We had one daughter, Renee, born the year I turned 32, back when the shop was still just 11 employees crammed into half the warehouse and Eleanor was keeping the books at our kitchen table most evenings after Renee went to bed. Renee grew up watching both of us work harder than either of us probably should have, and she married a man named Derek Sullivan 14 years ago, a personable, ambitious man who runs his own small manufacturing consultancy, advising mid-sized shops on efficiency and automation, the kind of work that sounds impressive at a dinner party and, as I would eventually learn, had been quietly struggling for the better part of 2 years by the time that Christmas dinner in the garage happened. I want to be honest about something before I go further, because it matters to everything that comes after. I did not dislike Derek in the beginning. I found him sharp, capable, good for Renee in the ways that seemed to matter. He pushed her toward ambitions she'd talked herself out of before she met him, and for a long time I credited him for that, genuinely. What I noticed, over the 2 years following Eleanor's death, was something more specific than dislike. It was a pattern, the kind of pattern you learn to spot after 4.5 decades of tolerance work, where a component that's off by even a few thousandths of an inch will function almost perfectly for a long time before it fails all at once, and the failure, when it finally comes, always traces back to a deviation that was there from the very beginning, small enough to miss unless you were measuring carefully. Renee moved back into my house 8 months after Eleanor passed, along with Derek, ostensibly to help me manage things during what she called the hardest year, and I was grateful for the company, genuinely grateful, in a house that had gone so quiet after Eleanor's voice left it that some evenings I found myself talking to the refrigerator just to hear a human voice, even if it was only my own. But somewhere in the 18 months that followed, the conversations in that house began shifting in a direction I didn't fully register until much later. Derek started asking, casually at first, about the patent royalties, how they were structured, whether they could be assigned or transferred, whether I'd ever considered putting them into something that actually works for you instead of just sitting in an account. Renee started mentioning, with increasing frequency, how much easier things would be once everything's simplified, a phrase she used often enough that I began to notice it the way you notice a slight vibration in a machine that's running just a little bit wrong, not yet loud enough to call a problem, but present, and worth paying attention to eventually. I noticed it the way I used to notice, walking the floor of my own shop decades ago, when a piece coming off the line was drifting out of spec before the gauge had even confirmed it. A slight change in the sound of the cut, a shaving that curled just a little differently than it should have. Individually, none of what I was noticing at home meant much. Together, over those 18 months, it had started to feel less like a daughter and son-in-law settling into a shared household and more like something being carefully measured and cut to a specification I hadn't been shown. That Christmas, the one with the garage, was meant to introduce Derek's parents to some new business associates of his, a couple named Gregory and Patrice Findlay, who Derek described, in the weeks leading up to the holiday, as potential investors in a new venture, though he was vague enough about the details that I didn't press, assuming, the way you assume things about people you love, that he'd tell me more when he was ready. I'd offered, weeks earlier, to have the whole thing at my house, the way Eleanor and I always hosted Christmas for 30 years running, and Renee had seemed genuinely pleased by the offer at the time. It was only that afternoon, as the Findlays and the Sullivans arrived and the dining room filled with people I'd never met before, that I understood the dinner wasn't really being hosted by me at all. It was being hosted using my house, my table, my late wife's china, for a business conversation I hadn't been invited to be part of, and once that arrangement became inconvenient to explain to guests Derek clearly wanted to impress, the folding table and the space heater in the garage became the solution. I sat out there for the better part of 2 hours that night, eating slowly, listening to the muffled rise and fall of conversation through the wall, catching a laugh here, a toast there, the specific cadence of people telling each other exactly what they wanted to hear. At one point, close enough to the shared wall that the sound carried more clearly than anyone inside probably realized, I heard Derek's voice, warm and easy in the way it always was with people he wanted something from, say, once the royalty incomes fully consolidated under the new structure, we're looking at real, sustained capital, enough to get the automation line fully funded without touching anyone else's investment. I heard Gregory Findlay's voice respond, low and satisfied, something about timelines and quarterly projections. I set down my fork on Eleanor's good china, in my own garage, and I understood, with a stillness that had nothing to do with the cold coming through the space heater's thin warmth, that whatever new structure Derek was describing to his investors involved money that was, as of that moment, still entirely mine. I did not go inside. I did not open that door and demand an explanation in front of the Findlays, in front of Derek's parents, in front of my own daughter. I have thought many times about why I didn't, And I think the honest answer is the same one that carried me through 45 years of running a precision shop. You do not stop a machine mid-cycle and start shouting the moment you suspect something's drifted out of tolerance. You let it finish the cycle, you measure exactly what happened, and you understand the failure completely before you decide what to do about it. Shouting at a machine has never once fixed anything. Understanding it has fixed almost everything I've ever needed fixed. So I finished my dinner in the garage, on the good china, in the cold, and when Renee came out later that evening to collect my plate, apologizing again about the arrangement, telling me the Findleys had left impressed and that the evening had gone really well, actually. I told her I was glad, and that the food had been wonderful, which was true, even cold, even eaten alone 20 feet from my own family with a wall between us that I had built myself, decades earlier, back when I still believed every wall I put up in that house was meant to keep the cold out, never to keep anyone in or anyone else at a careful distance. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat alone in my workshop, the real one, the detached building behind the house where I still keep my tools, where the vise on that folding table had come from, and I thought about the shop foreman's daughter, a young woman named Priscilla Okafor who now handled patent licensing correspondence for Desmond's company, the one who called me every quarter, without fail, to walk through the royalty statement before it was mailed, a habit her father had started decades ago, and she'd simply continued out of what I always assumed was old-fashioned professional courtesy. I thought about the fact that my quarterly call with Priscilla was due in 11 days, and that for the first time in longer than I could remember, I found myself looking forward to it not out of routine, but because some instinct I couldn't yet name told me that call was going to matter a great deal more than it ever had before. I did not know it yet, sitting in that cold workshop at midnight with sawdust still on the workbench from a project I'd started weeks earlier and hadn't found the will to finish. But the phone call that would change everything was already 11 days away, and the woman who would make it had no idea yet either that a routine quarterly conversation about a patent royalty statement was about to become the first loose thread in something that had been quietly, carefully constructed against me for the better part of 2 years. Priscilla Okafor called on the second Tuesday in January, exactly on schedule the way she always did, and I could tell within the first 10 seconds of her voice that something was different this time. "Mr. Vance," she said, and she never called me anything but Mr. Vance despite 15 years of quarterly calls, a formality I'd long since stopped trying to talk her out of. "Before I read through the statement with you, I need to ask you something, and I hope you won't take it the wrong way. Did you recently authorize a change to the payment routing on your royalty account? A new banking instruction came through our licensing department last week, requesting that future quarterly payments be redirected to a business account under something called Sullivan Advanced Manufacturing Solutions." I sat very still at my kitchen table, the same table where Eleanor used to balance the shop's books decades ago, and felt something cold settle into my chest that had nothing to do with January weather. "I did not authorize that," I said. There was a pause on the line, the particular pause of a careful professional recalculating in real time. "I was concerned that might be the case," Priscilla said. "The request came in with a signed authorization letter, on what appeared to be your letterhead, requesting the routing change effective this quarter. But something about it didn't sit right with me, and I want to explain why, because I think it matters. My father built this licensing relationship with you over 15 years, Mr. Vance, and in all that time, you have never once initiated a change through anyone but me directly, by phone, the way we've always done it. This request came in by mail, addressed to our general licensing inbox rather than to me personally, and the signature, when I compared it against the signature on file from your original licensing agreement, didn't look quite right to me. I'm not a document examiner, but I've looked at your signature on paperwork for 15 years, and this one felt off in a way I couldn't fully explain until I looked at it a second time and noticed the little flourish on the H in Harold was missing entirely. You always flourish. Every time. I closed my eyes for a moment, sitting in that kitchen, and thought about 4.5 decades spent training my eye to notice 1,000th of an inch of deviation in a piece of steel, and felt a strange, quiet pride that a young woman in her 30s had learned to apply that same kind of attention to something as simple as the curl of a letter in my own signature. "I did not send that letter," I said. "And I did not authorize any change to where those payments go." "Then I'm glad I called before processing it," Priscilla said, and I could hear something firm settle into her voice, the sound of a decision already made. I'm putting a hold on this request effective immediately, and I'm going to need you to send me a written confirmation, through our normal process, reaffirming your current payment instructions. I'd also strongly recommend you look into who submitted this on your behalf, Mr. Vance, because whoever it was had access to information about your licensing structure that isn't public. They knew the exact company name, the exact account structure, even the letterhead template we've used in our correspondence with you for years. That's not a stranger guessing at a scheme. That's someone who's seen your actual paperwork. I thanked her, more than the words could carry, and sat at that table a long while after we hung up, turning over in my mind the name she'd mentioned. Sullivan Advanced Manufacturing Solutions. Derek's consultancy. The very venture he'd been describing to Gregory Findlay through the wall of my own garage on Christmas night. The one he'd said would be funded by royalty income, fully consolidated under the new structure. I did not call Renee that afternoon, and I did not call Derek. I want to be honest about why, because I think it matters to understand everything that came after. 45 years of running a precision shop teaches you that when you find one deviation, there is almost never just one. A machinist who cuts a part a few thousandths short on one dimension has usually made a compensating error somewhere else in the sequence, and if you only fix the one deviation you happen to catch, you ship a part that still fails, just in a place you haven't found yet. I needed to understand the whole sequence before I said a single word to anyone in that house. So I called Desmond Okafor directly, the man who'd bought my shop 9 years earlier and who I still trusted more than almost anyone left in my life besides my own daughter. Desmond had been my foreman for 18 years before the sale, had learned everything he knew about precision tolerance work standing beside me at a lathe, and when I told him what Priscilla had found, his voice went quiet in a way I recognized immediately, because it was the exact tone he used to use on the shop floor when he'd found something wrong with a batch that had already shipped. "Hal," he said, "I want you to come by the shop tomorrow. I want to show you something in our correspondence file that I think you need to see with your own eyes, not just hear about over the phone." What Desmond showed me the following morning, in the small conference room at the back of the shop where I'd once interviewed him for his very first job, was a folder of correspondence going back nearly a year. 3 separate letters, each one a slightly different attempt to modify some aspect of my licensing arrangement, each one bearing a signature that was close to mine but, once you knew to look for the missing flourish on the H, unmistakably not. One letter, dated 8 months earlier, had requested a partial assignment of licensing rights to a shell entity called Vance Sullivan Holdings, a request Desmond's own compliance officer had rejected at the time because it lacked the notarized authorization their internal policy required for any assignment of intellectual property rights, a rejection Desmond hadn't thought to mention to me because, in his words, "These requests come in sometimes from estate planners or family members trying to get ahead of something, and it looked routine enough that I figured you'd sort it out with whoever sent it, if it mattered." "It matters," I said, looking at that first letter, dated 8 months earlier, nearly 4 months before Eleanor's second stroke had even fully settled, which meant whatever Derek had been building toward had started while my wife was still alive, while I was still spending most of my days at her bedside instead of paying attention to the mail arriving at my own house. "There's something else," Desmond said, and he slid a 4th document across the table, this one more recent, dated just 2 weeks after Christmas. It was a formal notice, addressed to the 3 manufacturers who held active licenses on my patents, announcing that, effective the coming quarter, all licensing correspondence and royalty payments should be directed to Sullivan Advanced Manufacturing Solutions, acting as authorized financial representative for patent holder Harold Vance, per enclosed power of attorney. Attached to it was a photocopy of a document titled Limited Power of Attorney for Financial Matters, bearing my signature, granting Derek Sullivan authority to manage all patent licensing income and related financial correspondence on behalf of Harold Vance. I had never signed that document. I had never even seen it before that morning. "Desmond," I said, "I need you to not act on any of these requests, from anyone but me directly, effective immediately, and I need you to keep every piece of paper in this folder exactly where it is." "Already done," Desmond said. "Hal, I should have called you the first time one of these came in. I'm sorry I didn't. I assumed family matters were being handled the way families usually handle them." "You had no reason to assume otherwise," I said, and meant it, because I understood, sitting in that conference room, that whatever had been built against me had been built carefully enough, and slowly enough, that even a man who'd known me for 30 years hadn't seen a reason to be suspicious of a single piece of it on its own. I drove home that afternoon with the folder of documents on the passenger seat beside me, and I did not go inside right away. I sat in my own driveway for a long while, looking at the house I'd built with Eleanor 41 years earlier, at the garage where I'd eaten Christmas dinner alone 3 weeks earlier on the good china, and I thought about precision, about tolerance, about the specific difference between a part that's slightly off and a part that's been deliberately machined to a different specification than the one you were told you were building. That evening, I did something I want to describe carefully, because I think it matters to understand the kind of man I am, and the kind of man 45 years in a machine shop had made me into. I have a small workshop behind the main house, separate from the garage, where I still do fine work on old clocks and small mechanisms as a hobby, the way some retired men take up woodworking or fishing. Among the tools on my bench is a small illuminated magnifying lamp I use for close inspection work, an ordinary-looking piece of equipment with an articulated arm and a ring light around the lens. Years earlier, after a break-in at a neighbor's workshop 2 streets over, I had modified that lamp myself, fitting a small camera into the housing behind the ring light, angled to cover the workbench and the small sitting area beside it where Renee and Derek had, over the past year, taken to having what they called quiet talks in the evenings, away from what they assumed was the noise and distraction of the main house. The lamp uploaded footage automatically to a private cloud account whenever it found my home's wireless signal, the same habit of quiet, careful documentation I'd carried with me since long before any of this began, born out of nothing more sinister than an old machinist's instinct to keep a record of anything that mattered. I had never had cause to review that footage before. I want to be honest about that. I had installed the camera out of an old habit of caution, not suspicion of my own family, and in the 18 months since, I had checked it perhaps twice, mostly to confirm it was still functioning after a power outage. That night, sitting at my kitchen table with Desmond's folder open in front of me, I opened the cloud account for the first time with real purpose, and began scrolling backward through months of footage, looking for exactly the kind of conversation I now understood had probably been happening in my own workshop's sitting area for longer than I wanted to admit. I found it on the second night of searching, a conversation from 4 months earlier, in October, well before Christmas, before the Findleys, before Priscilla's call. Derek and Renee sat together on the small bench near my workbench, in the soft light of that modified lamp, and I watched my daughter's face on the small screen of my laptop, and listened to her voice, and understood, with a specific and total clarity, exactly how long this had actually been in motion. The power of attorney template Gregory's lawyer drafted is broad enough to cover the licensing income specifically, Derek was saying, his voice low but perfectly audible through the microphone built into that lamp's housing. We just need his signature on it, and once we have that, we can present it to the licensing companies as routine estate management, the kind of thing plenty of adult children handle for aging parents. Nobody's going to question it if we frame it that way. He's not going to just sign a power of attorney because we ask him to, Renee said, and there was something in her voice that I want to describe honestly, because it wasn't cruelty exactly. It was closer to exhaustion, the voice of someone who had talked herself into believing a hard thing was actually a kind thing. He barely lets me help him with his own doctor's appointments. He's proud, Derek. He's always been proud. Which is exactly why we don't ask him directly, Derek said. We get a signature from something else he's already comfortable signing, one of those insurance renewal forms, or the annual property tax appeal he does every year, and we lift the signature onto the new document. Gregory's had a document specialist recreate the flourish before. It's not as hard as people think, especially from a scanned original. He paused, and I heard, on that recording, the particular ease of a man who has already convinced himself the hardest part of a plan is behind him. By the time anyone at the licensing office asks a question, the money's already flowing through the new account, and your father's inheriting a business partnership with real capital behind it instead of $40,000 a year trickling in through a system Grandpa Desmond runs like it's still 1985. I sat in my kitchen at nearly 1 a.m, listening to my own daughter discuss forging my signature with the same tone she might have used discussing a kitchen renovation, and I felt something in my chest do the exact thing a precision ground shaft does right before it shears under a load it was never designed to carry. Not a sound exactly, but a shift, deep in the structure, The specific feeling of understanding that everything downstream of this moment was going to be permanently different from everything that came before it. I did not confront either of them that night, or the next morning, or for the 2 weeks that followed. I want to be honest about how difficult that restraint was, because I think it matters more than almost anything else in this story. There were mornings I sat across from Renee at the breakfast table, watching her pour coffee the exact way her mother used to, laughing at some small thing on the television, and felt the entire weight of what I knew pressing against the back of my throat, wanting badly to simply ask her, plainly, how she could have let this happen, how the daughter Eleanor and I had raised to value honest work above almost everything else, had come to believe that forging her own father's signature was a reasonable price for capital her husband's failing consultancy needed. I did not ask. I have spent a career understanding that the moment you announce you found a flaw in a mechanism, before you fully understand how deep it runs, is the moment the people responsible start hiding the rest of it more carefully. I needed to understand the whole sequence, not just the one deviation Priscilla had happened to catch. So the following week, I drove to see a lawyer named Diane Farrow, a sharp, unhurried woman in her 50s who had handled the licensing agreements for Desmond's purchase of my business 9 years earlier, and who I trusted, in the particular way you trust someone who has already proven, once, that they read every line of a document before they let you sign it. I brought her everything. The 3 rejected letters from Desmond's file. The forged power of attorney with my signature and its conspicuously absent flourish. And a recording, 4 months old, of my own daughter and son-in-law discussing exactly how they intended to obtain a genuine signature to lift and reproduce onto a document I had never actually agreed to sign. Diane listened to that recording twice, the second time with a legal pad in front of her, pen moving steadily, and when it finished, she set the pen down and looked at me with an expression I recognized, because I had worn something close to it myself, more than once, standing over a batch of parts that had all failed the same inspection for the same underlying reason. "Mr. Vance," she said, "I want to be very direct with you. What you've described is not a family disagreement about estate planning or financial help. This is a forgery of a legal instrument, combined with what sounds like a coordinated attempt to misrepresent that instrument to third parties, your licensing partners, in order to redirect income you never authorized redirecting. Depending on how far this has already progressed, we may also be looking at wire fraud, if any request has already gone out using postal or electronic means to misrepresent your authorization." She tapped the folder. "The document specialist your son-in-law mentioned on that recording concerns me most of everything here, because it tells me this wasn't an amateur attempt born out of frustration. Someone involved in this scheme understood exactly how signatures are forensically compared, and took specific steps to defeat that comparison." "What do we do?" I asked. "First," Diane said, "we notify every licensing partner you have, in writing today, that any request to modify your payment instructions or assign any rights must be verified directly with you, by phone, using a passphrase we establish right now, before any action is taken on it. That closes whatever door is still open. Second, we need to understand the full scope of what's already been attempted or executed, because a plan this carefully built rarely stops at royalty income alone." She paused. "And third, Mr. Vance, I think we need to bring in law enforcement sooner rather than later, because forged power of attorney documents used to misdirect income from a living, competent adult are exactly the kind of pattern that elder financial exploitation statutes were written to address, and the earlier we document this properly, the stronger the case becomes." I sat in Diane Farrow's office that afternoon, in a building 2 blocks from the shop I'd built from a single second-hand lathe, and thought about my wife's good china sitting in a garage on Christmas night, about the missing flourish on a signature that wasn't mine, about my own daughter's voice on a recording discussing my forged authorization with the same practical tone she might use planning a vacation, and I understood that whatever came next was going to require every ounce of the patience that 4.5 decades of precision work had taught me to hold. Diane's paralegal spent the better part of 2 weeks compiling a full records review across every account and asset she could identify in my name, the patent royalty structure, my modest retirement accounts, the house itself, and a life insurance policy Eleanor and I had taken out together decades earlier, back when Renee was still small enough to need a policy naming a legal guardian in case something happened to both of us at once. What that review turned up, when Diane called me into her office on a gray Thursday morning in late January, made the forged power of attorney feel almost like the smallest piece of what had actually been built. "Mr. Vance," Diane said, sliding a folder across her desk, "I want to walk you through this carefully, because there's a lot here, and I want you to take whatever time you need with each piece." She opened the folder to the first document. "For months ago, in September, someone contacted your homeowner's insurance carrier requesting a policy review and an increase in coverage on a detached structure, specifically, your workshop, citing significant equipment upgrades. The request was made by phone, using security verification that matched your date of birth and the last 4 digits of your social security number closely enough to pass an initial screening. The coverage increase was approved, raising your workshop's insured value from around $40,000 to just over $210,000. I sat with that for a moment, turning it over the way I used to turn over a part that had come back from an outside vendor looking almost right, understanding intuitively that something about the dimensions didn't add up. "I never requested that," I said. "My workshop's worth what it's always been worth. I haven't upgraded anything out there beyond an inspection lamp and a few new hand tools." "That's precisely what concerned our investigator when she pulled this file," Diane said. "A coverage increase of that scale, on a structure with no corresponding upgrade in actual contents, is a pattern insurance fraud investigators are trained to flag, because it often precedes either an intentional loss event or a claim built around equipment that was never actually there to begin with." She turned the page. "There's more. In November, a formal claim was filed against that policy, reporting theft of specialized precision tooling from the workshop, valued at approximately $180,000. The claim included an itemized list of equipment, CNC-compatible measuring devices, calibrated gauge blocks, several named brands of precision instruments, none of which, according to your own inventory records from Desmond's shop archives, you have ever owned personally. Everything of that description belongs to Desmond's company, not to you individually." I felt something cold settle fully into my chest, the specific stillness of understanding a mechanism completely for the first time. "Someone filed an insurance claim for equipment that was never in my workshop," I said. "Equipment that doesn't exist." "The claim is currently under review," Diane said. "It hasn't yet been paid out, which is fortunate, because insurance fraud of this scale, if it had been paid, would have added felony insurance fraud to whatever other charges eventually apply. But Mr. Vance, I need to ask you something directly, and I want an honest answer, because it matters for how we build this from here. Is there any chance at all that Derek or Renee had legitimate access to your homeowner's policy information, a joint account, an authorized user status, anything that might explain how someone was able to pass the carrier's identity verification without directly impersonating you?" I thought about that question longer than any other she'd asked me. "Renee has had a key to my house since she was 16, I said slowly. "She's helped me with paperwork since her mother's stroke, insurance renewals, doctor's office forms, things like that. I gave her access to help me, because navigating all of it alone, after Eleanor got sick, was more than I could manage for some weeks." I looked up at Diane. "I gave her the tools to help me. I never imagined she'd use them to build something like this." Diane was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone choosing her next words with real care. "That access explains the mechanism," she said finally. "It doesn't change what was built with it." Helping an aging parent navigate paperwork and constructing a fraudulent insurance claim using that same access are two very different things, and the evidence we're building is going to need to draw that line clearly, for your sake and for the sake of anyone eventually asked to judge this fairly. I drove home that afternoon in a kind of fog I hadn't experienced since the week Eleanor's second stroke took the last of what remained of her, and I sat in my truck in my own driveway for the better part of an hour before I could make myself go inside, thinking about a life insurance policy, about a workshop full of tools that had never existed, about a daughter who had spent months constructing a fictional inventory of equipment specific enough to survive an insurance adjuster's scrutiny, and I understood that whatever version of Renee had built all of this had been operating in a register of deliberate, sustained calculation that I did not recognize as belonging to the daughter I thought I knew. That evening, going back through the workshop lamps footage with a patience I didn't know I still had, I found the conversation that explained the insurance claim, dated 6 weeks after the power of attorney conversation I'd already discovered. Derek and Renee sat in the same spot on the small bench, the same soft light from the same modified lamp illuminating a version of my daughter. I was still, even then, trying to reconcile with the one who had sat beside her mother's hospital bed 3 years earlier, holding her hand through 11 months of a decline neither of us had been prepared for. The claims adjuster wants an itemized list with approximate purchase dates, Derek was saying. I already pulled specifications for equipment similar to what's in Desmond's shop. Same brands, same models, enough overlap that if anyone ever cross-references it, it looks like your father simply upgraded his home setup to match what he used professionally for decades. Completely plausible, on paper. And if the adjuster wants to physically inspect the workshop? Renee asked, and there was an edge in her voice that I want to describe honestly, because it sounded, on that recording, less like guilt and more like impatience with a logistical obstacle. Dad's out there every day. He's going to notice people poking around his own workshop asking about equipment that isn't there. We schedule the inspection for a week. We know he's got a doctor's appointment or something that gets him out of the house for a few hours, Derek said. Gregory's already floated covering part of the claim payout as a consulting fee back to us once it clears, which solves 2 problems. It gets the automation line funded faster, and it gets your father's royalty situation resolved before the licensing companies start asking harder questions about the power of attorney. He paused, and I heard, in that pause, the sound of a man doing arithmetic on another person's entire life. $210,000 from the insurance claim, plus the royalty income once it's fully redirected, that's real capital, Renee. That's the difference between the automation line actually happening and me spending the next 5 years consulting for shops that can't afford to pay me what I'm actually worth. I know, Renee said, and her voice on that recording had gone very quiet. I just keep thinking about what happens if he finds out before it's done. He won't, Derek said. He trusts you completely. He barely reads half the paperwork you hand him to sign these days, not since your mother passed. Grief does that to people. It makes them tired of paying close attention to things that used to matter to them. I sat at my kitchen table at nearly 2 a.m, listening to my son-in-law describe my own grief as a resource being carefully spent down, the same way you might describe drawing against a line of credit, and I understood, with a clarity that had nothing gentle left in it, exactly how thoroughly my trust had been measured, cut, and repurposed to specifications I had never agreed to. I brought this new recording to Diane the following morning, along with everything the records review had turned up, and she listened to it twice, the second time making notes so rapid I could hear her pen against the legal pad even from across the desk. Mr. Vance, she said when it ended, I need to bring in a detective today. Not next week. Today. What you've described now includes attempted insurance fraud, forgery, and what may constitute a coordinated scheme to defraud multiple parties. Your licensing partners, your insurance carrier, and you directly. This has moved well past what my office alone should be handling. Diane's contact in the county's financial crimes unit was a measured, unhurried detective named Renata Bishop, who arrived at Diane's office 2 days later carrying a legal pad and a manner so calm it seemed almost incongruous with the file she was about to review. She reminded me, oddly, of the best inspectors I'd worked with over the decades in my own shop, the ones who never rushed to measurement, because rushing was how you missed the one deviation that actually mattered. Mr. Vance, Bishop said, after reviewing the forged power of attorney, the fabricated insurance claim, and both workshop recordings, what you've documented here, independently, before any of us got involved, is more complete than most cases my unit builds from scratch over the course of months. I want to be honest with you about the scope of what we're likely looking at. A forged power of attorney used to redirect licensing income is serious on its own. Layering an insurance fraud scheme involving a fabricated equipment inventory on top of that suggests a level of coordination and planning that goes well beyond a single bad decision made under financial pressure. She paused, flipping back through her notes. I want to look more closely at Gregory Findlay as well, because the phrase your son-in-law used, covering part of the claim payout as a consulting fee, tells me Mr. Findlay may have a financial interest in this scheme succeeding that goes beyond simply investing in Derek's consultancy. That's not how a genuine investor typically talks about an insurance payout. What happens now? I asked. Now we build this the right way, Bishop said. I want a forensic document examiner to formally compare the power of attorney signature against verified samples of yours. I have a feeling that missing flourish Ms. Okafor caught is going to matter a great deal once it's examined under proper forensic standards. I want to trace exactly how the identity verification was defeated with your insurance carrier, because if someone used personal information you didn't voluntarily provide, that opens additional charges. And I want you to continue exactly as you have been, patient, quiet, giving no indication that anything has changed, because every additional step they take while we're documenting this is another piece of evidence we won't have to reconstruct after the fact. I want to pause here and tell you something about the weeks that followed, because they were, in their own particular way, harder than almost anything that came before or after them. Renee continued coming to me with small, ordinary requests. Help reviewing a form, a question about whether I needed anything picked up from the hardware store, an offer to make dinner on nights I usually managed on my own, and I answered each one warmly, the way I always had, while carrying inside me the specific, exhausting weight of a father who now understood, with total clarity, exactly what his daughter had been quietly building against him for the better part of a year. There were evenings I sat across from her at that kitchen table, watching her laugh at something on television, and felt something close to grief arriving early. Grief for a version of my daughter I was slowly coming to understand might not fully exist the way I'd always believed it did, alongside a version that clearly did exist and had chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, to build a fraud against the one parent she had left. I did not confront her. Not that week, not the week after. I had already decided, somewhere in Diane Farrow's office weeks earlier, that the only way to protect what remained of my life, the royalty income that would carry me through whatever years I had left, the workshop where I still built small things with my hands, the fragile, complicated relationship with a daughter I still loved even as I documented, methodically, exactly how she had betrayed me, was to give away nothing until the evidence made giving anything away entirely unnecessary. That patience was tested more severely than I expected on a Tuesday evening in February, when Renee sat down across from me at the kitchen table, unprompted, with a folder in her hands that I recognized immediately, because I had seen its contents already, played back to me weeks earlier on a laptop screen at nearly 2 a.m. "Dad," she said, sliding the folder toward me, "I want to talk to you about something. Derek and I have been thinking, and honestly, with everything you've been managing since Mom passed, we think it might make sense to simplify some of your financial paperwork. Put some things under a power of attorney, just so if anything ever happens medically, we're not scrambling to figure out how to help you. It's really just a formality. Standard stuff people our age do for aging parents all the time." I looked at my daughter across that table, in the same kitchen where her mother had once balanced the shop's books by hand, and I understood that this was the moment the entire careful architecture of the scheme finally arrived, in person, asking directly for the one thing that would have made everything else unnecessary to hide. I picked up the folder. I opened it slowly, the way I always open anything with my name on it that I didn't put there myself, and I looked at the document inside. A power of attorney, broadly worded, granting Derek and Renee joint authority over all financial accounts, licensing income, and insurance matters, and I felt, for the first time since Priscilla Okafor's phone call weeks earlier, the full weight of exactly how close this had come to simply working, if I had been even slightly less careful, even slightly less patient, even slightly less willing to sit alone in a garage on Christmas night and simply pay close attention. "I'll want my own lawyer to look this over before I sign anything," I said, closing the folder and setting it down between us. "You understand, sweetheart. A man my age can't be too careful with paperwork like this." Something flickered across Renee's face, there and gone in less than a second, the exact tell I'd learned to recognize decades earlier on a shop floor. The look of a machinist watching a part come off the line a fraction of a degree out of true and hoping, against the evidence of their own eyes, that no one else would notice. "Of course, Dad," she said. "No rush at all." I photographed both pages of that power of attorney with my phone before Renee left the kitchen that evening, and sent them to Diane with a single line of text. She brought it herself tonight, asking directly. Diane's response came back within minutes. "Don't sign. Don't react. This confirms the timeline we needed. I'll call Detective Bishop first thing tomorrow." I did not sleep well that night, lying awake listening to the old house settle around me the way it always did in February, the radiators ticking as the heat cycled on and off, and I thought about Eleanor, about what she would have made of watching our daughter slide a folder across a kitchen table asking permission to formalize a fraud already months in motion. I did not have an answer I was comfortable sitting with, and I have still not fully found one, even now, telling you this. Detective Bishop called 2 days later to say that the forensic document examiner had completed a preliminary review of the power of attorney signature, comparing it against 14 verified samples of my actual signature pulled from licensing agreements, tax documents, and my original shop incorporation papers going back decades. The examiner's initial findings are consistent with what your licensing coordinator first noticed, Bishop told me. The missing flourish on the H is present in every single verified sample and absent entirely from the forged document, along with several other inconsistencies in pressure and letter spacing that indicate the signature was traced or closely copied from a genuine sample rather than executed naturally. We're also examining the earlier documents from Desmond Okafor's file using the same standard. The insurance investigation moved in parallel, and it was here that the scope of what had actually been built finally became clear in a way that even I, having listened to 2 separate recordings of the scheme being discussed openly, had not fully anticipated. Bishop's team, working with a forensic accountant contracted through the county prosecutor's office, traced the claims adjuster assigned to the fraudulent theft report and discovered that the adjuster himself, a man named Curtis Whitfield, had a financial relationship with Gregory Findlay that predated the claim by nearly 3 years. Whitfield had processed and approved 2 prior claims connected to Findlay-affiliated businesses, both involving similarly specific, similarly fabricated equipment losses, both paid out without triggering the kind of scrutiny that should have flagged a pattern. Gregory Findlay isn't simply an investor Derek happened to bring into his consultancy, Bishop told me, in a meeting at Diane's office in early March, 3 weeks after Renee had slid that folder across my kitchen table. Our financial crimes unit has had Findlay's name connected informally to 2 other insurance fraud investigations over the past several years, neither of which ever reached a prosecutable threshold, largely because the claims were structured carefully enough, and the payouts modest enough individually, that nothing ever rose above what our office calls background noise. Your case is different, because the scale is larger, and because you documented the planning conversations directly, in your own son-in-law's voice, describing exactly how the claim was constructed and why. So this has happened before, I said. Just never at this size. It appears so, Bishop said. And it appears your case may be what finally makes the earlier ones prosecutable as well, because a pattern that couldn't be proven in isolation becomes much easier to establish once you have a clear, documented instance of exactly how the scheme operates from planning through execution. I sat with that for a long moment, thinking about a claims adjuster named Curtis Whitfield who I had never met, who had apparently helped defraud strangers before he ever touched my file, and understood that whatever protection I had managed to build for myself, through nothing more sophisticated than an old machinist's habit of paying close attention and keeping careful records, had quietly become something larger than my own situation alone. The warrants were prepared through the middle of March, while I continued, exactly as Bishop had instructed, behaving as though nothing had changed. Renee brought up the power of attorney twice more during those weeks, each time more gently, more casually, framed now as something she'd simply mentioned once and didn't want to pressure me about. And each time I told her I appreciated her thinking of me, and that my lawyer was still reviewing some general estate matters, which was, in its own careful way, entirely true. I want to tell you about one particular evening during that waiting period, because it was harder, in its own quiet way, than almost anything that came before or after it. Derek stayed home alone with me one Thursday night in early March, Renee having gone to help a friend with something across town, and we sat together in my workshop, the way we used to on evenings before any of this began, when I still believed the ease between us was simple affection rather than something being carefully cultivated for a purpose. He asked me, almost out of nowhere, whether I regretted selling the operating business to Desmond instead of eventually handing it to him. I built that business with my own hands, over 4.5 decades, I told him. Desmond earned it the same way I did, standing at a lathe, learning every mistake the hard way, the way you have to with precision work. It was never mine to hand to someone who hadn't done that work. He nodded slowly, and for a moment, sitting in that workshop with the same modified lamp illuminating both our faces, I let myself wonder, foolishly, whether some part of him wanted to say something honest, whether the man who'd once asked what a tension wrench was for as a much younger and less complicated version of my son-in-law might still exist somewhere underneath everything I now knew about him. The moment passed. His phone buzzed, he checked it, said something about needing to call Gregory back about the automation line's timeline, and the conversation moved on to something else entirely, leaving me alone with a question I have still not fully resolved, even now. The warrants were signed on a Wednesday morning in late March, nearly exactly 3 months after that Christmas dinner in the garage. Detective Bishop called me the evening before, as she'd promised she would, to tell me it would happen at 7 the following morning, and to stay at Desmond's shop, away from the house, until she called to confirm it was clear. I drove to Desmond's that evening instead of waiting until morning, sat in the same small conference room where he'd first shown me the folder of rejected correspondence weeks earlier, and did not sleep at all that night, listening to the old clock on his office wall, one I'd repaired myself, years earlier, as a favor, tick through what felt like the longest night of my life since the week Eleanor's second stroke took the last of what remained of her. The bishop called at 7:40. "It's done, Mr. Vance," she said. "Derek Sullivan and Gregory Findlay have both been taken into custody. Renee Sullivan is being charged separately based on the recorded conversations and her documented financial communications. Her attorney is negotiating her voluntary surrender, which we expect within the next day or two. Curtis Whitfield, the claims adjuster, has also been arrested pending review of the 2 prior claims we've connected him to." "Thank you for calling me directly," I said. "You built most of this case yourself, before we were ever involved," Bishop said. "I've worked a great many of these over the years. Most people spend the whole waiting period wanting to confront somebody. You spent it documenting instead, patiently, methodically, exactly like the work you must have done for 4.5 decades in that shop. That's rarer than you'd think, Mr. Vance." The months that followed the arrests moved the way Diane had warned me they would. Slowly, procedurally, at a pace entirely disconnected from my own sense of urgency. There were arraignments in April, brief and formal, where I sat in the back of a courtroom I'd never expected to spend any meaningful time in, and watched my own daughter enter a plea of not guilty in a voice that barely carried past the first row of seats. There was a grand jury proceeding in June, closed to the public, where I testified for nearly 5 hours about Priscilla Okafor's careful phone call, about the workshop lamps recordings, about the forged power of attorney and the fabricated insurance claim, answering questions from an assistant district attorney named Owen Marsh who built the case, piece by piece, with the same patient precision I recognized from my own decades of tolerance work. There were continuances through the summer, motions filed and argued over the admissibility of the workshop recordings, which Diane and Bishop's office fought and won, establishing on the record that our state's single-party consent law fully permitted recordings made on my own property, with me present as a party to conversations occurring in a space I owned, regardless of whether the other parties present were aware of the recording device. I want to tell you about one grand jury session in particular, because it stayed with me longer than almost anything else in that entire process. Owen Marsh asked me, near the end of my testimony, whether I had ever considered simply confronting my daughter the moment I first suspected something was wrong, rather than documenting everything so thoroughly before involving law enforcement. "I spent 45 years building precision instruments," I told him, and the grand jury room went quiet in a way that felt, to me, like the same quiet that used to settle over my shop floor whenever a batch came back from final inspection. In all that time, I never once fixed a machine that was cutting parts out of tolerance by walking over and shouting at it. You measure it. You understand exactly how it drifted, and by how much and over what period of time. Only then do you know what actually needs fixing, and whether the machine itself is salvageable, or whether the whole assembly needs to be replaced. I paused, and thought about Renee's face across the kitchen table, the folder sliding toward me, the flicker I'd recognized before she managed to smooth it back into place. I needed to understand exactly how my daughter had drifted, and how far, before I could know what was actually left to save. The trial began the following January, almost exactly a year after that Christmas dinner in the garage. I will not walk you through every day of it, because much of it unfolded the way these proceedings always do. A forensic document examiner explaining, with magnified projections the jury could study for themselves, the specific inconsistencies between my genuine signature and the forged one on the power of attorney. A forensic accountant walking the jury through the fabricated insurance claim, the fictional equipment inventory, and Curtis Whitfield's prior connection to Gregory Findley's earlier, smaller schemes. Priscilla Okafor testified on the second day, describing, in her calm, careful voice, exactly why a missing flourish on a single letter had been enough to make her stop and question a routine request rather than simply processing it. "I've reviewed Mr. Vance's signature on paperwork for 15 years, she told the jury. You learn the small details of a person's handwriting the way you learn the sound of a familiar voice. When something's missing that's always been there, you notice, even if you can't immediately explain why it matters. I've learned, in this line of work, that the account holder deserves to know before anyone else does, whenever something doesn't sit right." Desmond Okafor testified as well, describing the folder of rejected correspondence going back nearly a year, and the moment he'd first understood the scale of what was being attempted against his old mentor and friend. Under cross-examination, Derek's attorney, a composed man named Franklin Reyes, tried to suggest that the earlier rejected letters could have originated from a legitimate estate planning attempt gone through improper channels, rather than deliberate fraud. Desmond, patient in the way I'd trained him to be over 18 years at my side, simply pulled out the fourth document, the forged power of attorney with its accompanying notice to my licensing partners, and read the specific language aloud, slowly, twice, until the argument had nowhere left to go. Detective Bishop testified about the workshop lamps footage, walking the jury through the technical chain of custody, establishing that the recordings were unaltered, continuous, and lawfully obtained on my own property. The jury watched both recordings in full, the October conversation about the power of attorney, and the December conversation about the insurance claim, and I watched their faces as they watched and saw, in more than one juror, the specific shift in posture that comes when 12 strangers finally understand, completely, the shape of what they're being asked to judge. I sat in that courtroom, in the gallery, beside Desmond, who had insisted on attending every single day of testimony despite the toll it clearly took on both of us, and I thought, more than once, about the good china sitting cold on a folding table in my own garage on Christmas night, about a space heater's thin warmth against a January chill, and about how strange it was that the thing which finally protected me had been the exact same instinct that built my entire career, the belief that you do not fix a mechanism by shouting at it. You study it, patiently, until you understand precisely how it failed. And only then do you decide what to do about it. Curtis Whitfield's attorney attempted, predictably, to argue that his client had simply processed a claim within the normal bounds of his professional discretion, and that any irregularities in the underlying documentation belonged entirely to Derek and Renee Sullivan, not to the adjuster reviewing it. That argument held together for a while, until the prosecution introduced a text message, recovered from Whitfield's own phone under a valid search warrant, sent to Gregory Findley 6 weeks before the claim was filed. Same structure as the last two. Keep the itemized list specific enough to look real, vague enough that nobody can verify individual serial numbers. I'll make sure it clears the review without a physical inspection, same as always. The courtroom went very quiet after that message was read aloud. The particular silence that settles over a room once the last remaining innocent explanation has been removed from the table entirely. Gregory Findley did not testify in his own defense. His attorney negotiated a plea agreement in the second week of trial, once it became clear that between Whitfield's own text messages, the forensic accountant's tracing of the prior fraudulent claims, and the 2 workshop recordings establishing the scheme's origins in explicit detail, there was almost no room left for an alternative account of events. Findley pleaded guilty to insurance fraud and conspiracy to commit fraud, with the forensic accountant's testimony establishing that at least 2 other victims, in addition to myself, had unknowingly funded his and Whitfield's earlier, smaller schemes over the preceding several years. Renee testified on the 4th day, called by her own attorney in an attempt to establish, before the jury reached a verdict on her charges, that her role had been driven by financial desperation and her husband's persistent pressure rather than independent malice toward me. She sat in the witness box in a plain gray dress, hands folded carefully in front of her, and described a version of events in which Derek had made every technical decision, in which Gregory Findley's promises of quick, substantial capital had felt, at the time, like a genuine solution to financial strain she hadn't fully understood the depth of until it was already too late to extract herself cleanly. "I love my father," she said, and her voice caught in a way that seemed, from where I sat in the gallery, genuinely felt, even though I could no longer be entirely certain what genuine meant, coming from her, after everything I had already heard on those 2 recordings. I convinced myself, somehow, that we were just moving things around temporarily, that it wouldn't actually cost him anything in the end, that we'd find a way to make it right before he ever had to know any of it happened. The prosecutor, Owen Marsh, rose for cross-examination with the patient, unhurried manner of someone who had been waiting for this exact moment since jury selection began weeks earlier. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, "you've testified that your involvement was driven by financial pressure and your husband's decisions, and that you believed, at the time, this wouldn't ultimately cost your father anything. Is that correct?" "Yes," Renee said. "I'd like to direct your attention to Prosecution Exhibit 52, already admitted into evidence," Marsh said. "This is a recording taken from your father's workshop, dated 4 months before the forged power of attorney document was presented to him directly." He paused a moment before continuing, letting the numbers settle in the room. "In this recording, you state, and I'm quoting directly, 'I just keep thinking about what happens if he finds out before it's done.' Mrs. Sullivan, can you explain to the jury why, if you genuinely believed this arrangement wouldn't ultimately harm your father, you were specifically concerned about what would happen if he discovered it before it was completed?" There was a long pause before Renee answered, long enough that I watched more than one juror lean forward slightly, waiting. "Because," she said finally, quietly, "some part of me already knew he wouldn't have agreed to any of it, if we'd simply asked him honestly." "So you understood, at the time, that this was not something your father would have consented to," Marsh said. "Is that a fair characterization of what you just told this jury?" Renee's folded hands went very still. "Yes," she said. "That's fair." Marsh sat down. The courtroom held that particular silence a moment longer than these moments usually last. The sound of a room absorbing something it had already suspected but had just heard confirmed directly, in the words of the person it concerned most. Derek did not testify in his own defense. His attorney negotiated a plea agreement in the 3rd week of trial, once the combined weight of the forged power of attorney, the fabricated insurance claim, the 2 workshop recordings, and Whitfield's own incriminating text message had left almost nothing available to contest. He pleaded guilty to forgery of a legal instrument, conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, and attempted financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, with the prosecution noting, for the sentencing record, that the scheme had been in active development for over a year before the Christmas dinner that first drew attention to the family's shifting dynamics. Renee pleaded guilty to a lesser conspiracy charge, her attorney successfully arguing that while her involvement, documented directly on both recordings, went beyond simple ignorance, the scheme's architecture and primary execution had originated with Derek and Gregory Findlay rather than with her independently. She received probation, along with a restitution order covering a portion of the legal costs the case had generated, and a formal acknowledgement in the sentencing record that her cooperation with investigators, once her attorney began negotiating on her behalf, had been substantive and had helped corroborate several details of the timeline that the workshop recordings alone had not fully established. At sentencing, the judge, a measured man who had clearly read every page of an extensive file before anyone stepped into his courtroom, noted for the record that the case was unusual in the thoroughness of its evidentiary foundation, established almost entirely through the sustained diligence of the victim and the conscientiousness of a licensing coordinator who noticed a single missing detail in a signature and refused to let it pass without question. He added that he found the scheme's duration and layered construction, a forged power of attorney, a fabricated insurance claim built on false equipment records, and the involvement of a corrupted claims adjuster with a documented history of similar fraud, to represent a particularly calculated and sustained pattern of exploitation against a man whose only apparent failing was trusting the people closest to him not to weaponize that trust against his own financial security. Derek received 4 years, with parole eligibility after 20 months, along with a permanent order barring him from any financial authority over my affairs. Gregory Findlay received 5 years, given the scope of his conduct across multiple identified victims. Curtis Whitfield received 3 years and the permanent revocation of his insurance adjuster's license. Renee's probation ran for 3 years, with mandatory restitution and a formal condition requiring continued cooperation with the ongoing investigation into Findlay's earlier claims. Before sentencing concluded, the judge permitted victim impact statements, and I stood, with Diane's quiet encouragement beside me, and said the only thing I had prepared, because 4.5 decades spent making instruments that had to work exactly right, every single time, had taught me that fewer words, chosen with real care, land harder than many words chosen in anger. I said that I had built a business from a single second-hand lathe and a line of credit my own father co-signed against his life insurance policy, because I believed, at 29 years old, that if you built something with enough precision and enough patience, it would hold its shape regardless of what pressure was eventually placed on it. I said I never expected the pressure that would eventually test that belief most severely would come from inside my own house, from people I had spent decades trusting without question. I said that on a Christmas night 3 years ago, I had eaten dinner alone in my own garage, on my late wife's good china, and said nothing, not because I had nothing to say, but because I understood, even then, that some problems cannot be fixed by shouting the moment you notice them. I said I did not stand there wanting revenge, only wanting the full truth recorded plainly, in a room where no one could ever again call it a simple misunderstanding over holiday seating arrangements. Then I sat down. After the courtroom cleared, a bailiff asked whether I would be willing to speak with Renee for a few minutes before she was escorted out to begin her probation intake process. I said yes. They brought her to a quiet corner of the hallway outside the courtroom, and she looked, standing there in that plain gray dress, smaller than I had seen her look in years, and for one unwelcome moment she reminded me so strongly of the little girl who used to sit on the floor of my old shop, watching me work at the lathe, asking endless questions about what each machine did, that my chest ached in a way that had nothing to do with anger at all. "Dad," she said, and her voice cracked on the single syllable. I don't know how to explain any of it in a way that doesn't sound like I'm making excuses. Derek kept saying it wouldn't really cost you anything, that we'd fix it before you ever had to know, and I let myself believe that because believing it was easier than looking at what we were actually doing. I looked at my daughter for a long moment, the way I used to look at a part that had come back from inspection clearly out of tolerance, trying to understand not just that it had failed, but exactly where in the process the failure had first begun. I've spent 45 years building things that had to hold their shape under real pressure, I said finally. I know the difference between a mechanism that simply wears down over time, the way anything does eventually, and one that's been deliberately forced past what it was built to withstand. What happened to me wasn't wear, Renee. It was force, applied deliberately, over a long period, by people who understood exactly what they were doing. I paused. I don't know yet whether I'll ever fully trust you again the way I did before that Christmas. I hope, for both our sakes, that someday I might. But that's going to depend entirely on what you do with the years ahead of you, not on anything either of us says in this hallway today. She nodded, tears running freely now, and did not try to argue with any part of it, which was, in its own small way, the first fully honest moment she had offered me in longer than I could clearly measure. The bailiff led her away. I stood in that hallway a long while before Desmond, who had waited quietly nearby the entire time, gently took my arm and walked with me out into the cold March afternoon. The house on the property where I've lived for 41 years sold quickly last spring, not because I wanted to leave it, but because Diane pointed out, gently, that a house this large, this quiet, was no longer serving the purpose it once had, and that some structures, once you understand exactly how they've been used against you, are hard to feel entirely at peace inside again, no matter how many good years came before the bad ones. I didn't sell the whole property. I kept the workshop, moved it, quite literally, board by board, with a small crew Desmond arranged through his shop, onto a smaller lot I bought 2 miles closer to town, close enough that I can walk to see Desmond most mornings if the weather allows it. I sold the main house to a young family with 2 children under 10, who stood in the driveway on the day of the final walkthrough and asked, with a particular hopefulness of new homeowners, whether the detached garage out back might work as a playroom someday. I told them it would work beautifully for that, and meant it, and did not mention what that garage had once meant to me on a single Christmas night, because some histories belong only to the people who lived them, and I had decided, somewhere in the 2 years since, that I no longer wanted that garage's meaning to be the last thing anyone thought of when they looked at it. I still run my quarterly calls with Priscilla Okafor exactly the way we always have, though these days the conversation runs a little longer than it used to, because we've both, in our own ways, become people who understand each other a bit more completely than a simple business relationship usually allows. She sends me a card every Christmas now, a habit that started the year after the trial and shows no sign of stopping, and I keep every one of them in a drawer in my new workshop, alongside Eleanor's old ledger books from the early years of the shop, two very different kinds of proof that careful, patient attention to small details eventually adds up to something worth protecting. Desmond and I still meet most weeks, sometimes for actual business. He still asks my opinion on tolerance specifications for a few of the more demanding aerospace contracts his shop takes on, though he needs my input far less than he still seeks it out. And sometimes for nothing more than the easy, comfortable quiet of two men who've known each other for 30 years sitting together over coffee, not needing to fill every silence with words. Priscilla joined us for coffee one Saturday morning last fall, and somewhere in that conversation, without either of us quite planning it, we started talking about setting up a small fund through the shop, informal for now, meant to help other aging patent holders and small business owners recognize the early signs of exactly the kind of exploitation I nearly missed entirely, if not for one young woman's careful attention to the curl of a single letter in my own signature. We haven't fully worked out what that fund will look like yet, but I find myself, most weeks, looking forward to the shape it might eventually take, the way I once looked forward to watching a rough piece of steel slowly become something precise and useful under my own hands. Renee and I speak now, roughly once a month, careful, measured conversations that neither of us rushes and neither of us fully trust yet, in the way conversations between people rebuilding something broken rarely can be rushed or fully trusted, not for a long while, and maybe not ever completely again. She completed the first full year of her probation without incident, has separated from Derek. A decision she made, she told me, sometime during the second month of his incarceration, once the version of him she encountered in visitation, still calculating, still explaining away his own conduct as unfortunate circumstance rather than deliberate choice, became impossible for her to reconcile with any version of a future she still wanted for herself. I do not know, even now, exactly what to make of that separation, whether it represents something real and lasting in her, or simply the natural consequence of a partnership that had always been built more on shared ambition than on anything sturdier. I have decided, for my own sake as much as hers, not to need a complete answer to that question before I allow myself to keep showing up for the monthly phone calls, keep listening for whatever small, honest details she chooses to share, keep leaving room, carefully and without any guarantee, for the possibility that some of what I once believed about my daughter might still, eventually, prove to have been true all along. I think often, more than I probably should, about the difference between the little girl who sat on my shop floor asking what a tension wrench was for, and the woman who slid a folder across my kitchen table asking for a power of attorney she and her husband had already spent months trying to forge without my knowledge. I have come to believe, the way I once came to understand certain stubborn mechanical failures after years of studying them, that both of those people were entirely real, existing in the same person at different moments, shaped by different pressures, capable of different things depending on which pressure happened to be bearing down hardest at any given time. I have not found a way to hold both of those truths without it costing me something, and at 74 years old, I have stopped expecting that I ever fully will. Some mechanisms, once you understand precisely how they failed, are never trusted quite the same way again, even after every visible repair holds exactly as it should. If there is a lesson in any of this, and I have had a great deal of time, sitting alone in a new workshop 2 miles from the house where I raised my only child, to think about what that lesson actually is, it is the one I finally said out loud to Desmond, over coffee, nearly 2 years after that Christmas dinner in the garage, when he asked me the question I could tell he had been quietly sitting on for a very long time, whether I regretted saying nothing that night, whether some part of me wished I had simply opened that door, walked back into my own dining room, and demanded to know why I was being fed alone in the cold beside a space heater and an extension cord. I told him no. I told him that in 45 years of precision work, I never once fixed a machine that was cutting parts out of tolerance by shouting at it in the middle of its cycle. You let it finish. You measure exactly what happened, and precisely how far it drifted, and over what period of time the drift occurred. And only once you understand the entire failure, completely, from its very first cause through its final, cascading effect, do you decide what to do about it, and whether the mechanism itself is still worth saving, or whether the whole assembly finally needs to be replaced. Family stories about being pushed quietly to the margins rarely look the way you'd expect, going in. They don't usually arrive as a slammed door or a raised voice. They arrive as a folding table set up in a garage, using the good china, with an explanation already prepared before anyone's even asked for one. They arrive as a missing flourish on a single letter that one careful young woman happened to notice. They arrive as an old man's habit of installing a small camera in an inspection lamp, out of nothing more than an old machinist's instinct toward careful documentation, years before he ever imagined he'd need it for anything more serious than confirming the lamp still worked after a power outage. But they can end, if you are patient enough and careful enough, and willing to measure the whole failure before you ever decide what to do about it, with the truth laid out so plainly, in a room full of strangers, that no one can ever again call it a simple misunderstanding, and with an old man, back at his workbench in a new workshop, hands still steady, still capable of building something precise and lasting, still able to sit alone in a quiet room and mean it, completely, when he says he is, at long last, all right. If this story reached you, tell me honestly in the comments, would you have said something that night in the garage, or would you have waited the way Hal did? Tell me whether you think a missing detail as small as the curl of a single letter deserves the credit it gets in a story like this one, or whether you think Hal's own decades of patient, careful attention were really what saved him long before Priscilla ever picked up that phone. And if you've ever had to sit quietly with something painful, gathering the full picture before you said a single word about it, I want to hear how you knew when the moment to finally act had actually arrived. Share this with someone who needs the reminder that patience, paired honestly with careful attention, is its own particular kind of strength. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good time. There's more where this came from. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. It means more than you know. A final note before we go. Some stories on this channel include fictional elements, crafted to explore real emotional truths and life lessons. If that's not the kind of content you're looking for, that's completely alright. We hope you'll find something else on the channel that suits you better. We'll see you in the next one.